Hello. Can everyone hear me? Yes, great. Hi, and welcome to our Healthy Minds at Work virtual conversation. Today's conversation will be with Center for Healthy Minds scientist Matt Hirshberg and MMSD Mindfulness lead Sara Parrell. Matt will share his research on the role of contemplative practice in developing educator well-being and equitable teaching practices. I know that's a hot topic for this group in particular, so looking forward to that conversation. So you'll hear from Matt and Sara in just a minute, but I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Monica Canfield-Lenfest. I'm a member of the Customer Success team with Healthy Minds at Work, and I'll be your moderator for today. Just to get started, I wanted to review a few pieces of housekeeping. It looks like folks have muted themselves, but if you haven't yet, if you can just go into the lower left portion of your screen and click that microphone icon there just to make sure you're muted so everyone can hear. Thank you. Great. We'll have a Q&A portion of our webinar today.
Hi, you might be the only one, and I might.
Hi.
Technology is not helping me out today, so.
Hi, we can hear you. Great. I think you found the mute button. Welcome. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can raise your hand in your Zoom function. If you click on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, that'll pop up a list. You can see who else is on the call with you, and then you can click raise hand to raise your hand, and then I can call on you to unmute you. Can folks try to do that now, just to practice? Let's see. Okay, I see a few. Great. Great, and if for some reason that functionality isn't working, when it comes down time for the Q&A, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up if there's a good moment to chime in. I also wanted to mention before we move forward that we have heard from a few people that there are some issues with getting logged out of the app and having trouble logging back in over the weekend. So if you are having that problem, we're really sorry. We're working on it and hope to have a fix as soon as possible. But if you have had an issue getting logged out of the Healthy Minds at Work app and haven't been able to log back in, if you could just email us at support@hminnovations.org, our support line, just so we can keep track of everyone who's having this issue and make sure it's fixed as soon as possible. Okay, great. So there'll be plenty of time to address further questions later on, but I wanted to pass it to Matt and Sara to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone. Happy to be here with you. My name's Matt Hirshberg. I'm a scientist at the Center for Healthy Minds. I'm also a former middle school teacher, and I'm looking forward to talking with you for the next hour or so.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Sara Parrell. I'm a lead nurse in our district, and I'm also coordinating a lot of the work around mindfulness and MMSD, a program. It's in its third year officially through a partnership with UW Health Mindfulness Program, but even before that with the Center for Healthy Minds and now Healthy Minds Innovation. So we're just very grateful and excited to be working with Healthy Minds at Work in our district as part of that partnership. And I think Matt and I have been circling for about 4 or 5 years. So Matt's really been at the table with the district since he was in his early graduate school days. So we're really excited to continuing to partner not only with the Center and Healthy Minds Innovation, but with Matt in particular. So thank you, Matt.
Great. So before we dive into the research, thought it would be great to start with a practice. So if you can, just find yourself in a comfortable upright position. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes, finding a soft, focused gaze, just set a clear intention to be present and bring your awareness to the breath. Noticing your feet on the floor. Bringing your awareness to the sensations in the body. As you notice the breath. When your mind wanders, gently bring it back to the sensation of the breath. Resting your awareness on the movement of the inhale and the exhale. Notice as you exhale the natural sense of releasing. And notice how you feel in this moment. Any sensations that are present in the body, emotions that may be bubbling up. And set an intention to move through your day with awareness. As you begin to bring your attention back into the room, gently opening your eyes if they're closed, and continuing on with this conversation. Okay, so Matt, we'll pass it to you.
So I am going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see if I can get this working. So can everybody see the, oops. So can everybody see a PowerPoint slide now? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to give a very short sort of 20,000 foot vantage point on why do this stuff in the first place, why practices that you're learning in the Healthy Minds program, and particularly try to tie that back to the context of education, schools and school districts, and the roles and responsibilities that people play in schools and school districts. So I like to present this picture. This is the middle school that I worked at, and I won't get into the whole story, but it's a beautiful and idyllic looking school, and in many ways it was an idyllic place to teach. Lots of resources, very highly educated parents that cared a lot about their kids' education and were really active, really high achieving. It was one of the highest achieving districts in Massachusetts, a lot of really smart kids. And yet, even in the midst of this rather perfect sort of, at least from the outside, educational environment, if you walked around and polled teachers, there were many teachers who were stressed and even burnt out. And it illustrates, I think, something important about teaching, but any profession really, which is even when all of the external conditions that support whatever the professional goals are present, people internally still often struggle. And what that suggests or indicates to me is that learning to be an effective teacher or administrator or principal or whatever, it is important that the external factors that support that are present. That is no doubt helpful and important. But there are also internal factors that determine in many ways how successful you'll be at what you're doing. Successful both in terms of whatever your professional outcomes are, but also your own internal state, your well-being or lack thereof. So that sort of realization is part of what led me to graduate school. And it turns out that the educational research is quite overwhelming in this regard, but basically learning is it's a process of relational dynamics. And we can hear you. So it really is, if you look at a classroom, or if you want to look at what the strongest predictors of student achievement are, you try to get some gauge of the classroom environment, the classroom context, and the interpersonal dynamics that are present in that classroom. And those predict how students will do more strongly than almost anything we can know about a teacher. Like, do they have a graduate degree? How many years have they been teaching, et cetera? So teaching and learning are really a process, interrelational process. And if we look at a school system more broadly, this is really, I mean, it's really true in any sector, but maybe more true in education than others. And your ability to positively impact students, if you're a teacher, or teachers if you're a principal, or everyone if you're a district administrator, in some way really does come down to how well you're able to relate to them, and how well you're able to communicate and listen and be patient and give direction in a way that people can understand and accept it. So these are all the ability to actualize these types of effective relational dynamics depend, we think, on a bunch of individual, what you might call individual level skills. So like patience, for example, or the ability to be attentive and listen, or the ability just to be kind and generous. So the types of practices that you're learning historically have been used to develop exactly those types of individual level skills or competencies. So we've come up with a list. This is sort of hypothetical, but it's based on what we know at the moment about teaching, of skills that are important to teaching. Again, I'm being a little teacher-centric, but I think if you're in an administrator role or a principal role, I think you can see the importance of demonstrating these types of competencies when you're interacting with teachers or parents or other staff in the school or students. So again, this is a 20,000 foot vantage point. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I just want to point out a couple things about them. The first is that these types of contemplative practices for thousands of years have been thought to develop exactly these types of competencies. And we're finding now through more recent educational research that it appears that underlying the ability to put into practice best teaching practices are these very competencies. And these are also the same competencies, and this is work that the center's been doing for decades now. These are the very same competencies that support personal well-being. So what we're seeing is like a convergence of personal, interpersonal, professional skills that are highly overlapping. So these are just, I won't go into too much detail, but this is just a way to frame in a classroom setting what effective interpersonal dynamics look like. And I think that's all I'll say about that. So the last thing I want to talk about is, and I'm realizing this speaker is close to me, so I hope it's not like I'm yelling into it for all of you out there in digital space. Another thing we're learning about, and I'm going to be teacher-centric here, but for people who are administrators or principals, I don't think it will be too hard to transfer this to your particular context. What we're learning about good teaching is that actually good teaching is equitable. Good teaching is equitable teaching practice. And I'll present data from 2 studies that show this in very different ways. But it's becoming quite clear that basically in a classroom environment, if teachers are demonstrating those 4 classroom management competencies that I quickly showed earlier, then they have an equitable classroom, actually. They have equitable outcomes in their classroom. So let me skip actually to this one. So this is one example. This was a study that was done, and some of you may be aware, but there's a pretty massive race gap in exclusionary discipline. So African-American kids in particular are much more likely to receive exclusionary discipline than white kids are. And this is true even after controlling for things like socioeconomic status and even teacher reports of behavior, which makes you wonder what's going on if after controlling for this, there's still this race gap in exclusionary discipline. So what this study did is they basically just trained teachers in a method for becoming more aware of and being able to identify these types of effective teaching practices. They did this for a year. The teachers recorded themselves teaching once a month. They coded themselves with a sort of professional coder, like in this iterative process. And what they found in the year after is that teachers improved on those 4 domains of teaching, and they also significantly reduced the discrepancy between exclusionary discipline given to Black and white students. So what's important is that the teachers didn't know that this was the purpose of the study. They just got an intervention to be a better teacher, and they did become better teachers according to these domains, but the consequence of being a better teacher was that they're no longer demonstrating this huge race gap in exclusionary discipline. And one of the reasons why is that kids were reporting being much more engaged. So probably there was less problem behavior. That was probably part of what was going on. And then another example comes from a study that we did at the center. This was a mindfulness study. So we trained pre-service teachers in practices very similar to the types of practices that you're learning right now. And we gave them what's called an implicit association task. So I won't go into the details, but basically it's a way to measure what we call implicit race bias, which is a very prominent phenomenon in America. And implicit race bias in teachers predicts lower grades for African-American students. It predicts poor quality feedback. It also predicts the exclusionary gap in race discipline. So this was a mindfulness study. Again, there was no anti-bias component to this, no component about equitable teaching practices. It was strictly a mindfulness component, mindfulness intervention. But what we found is that after the intervention, and then 6 months after the end of the intervention, on this measure of implicit race bias towards children, the control group basically didn't change at all. So the group that didn't get the mindfulness training more or less stayed the same, but the group that did get the mindfulness training showed this really big decrease in implicit race bias. And this decrease held up 6 months post-intervention. So we also find that the pre-service teachers that got the intervention. So this group also showed improvement on all three. The measure we used to assess classroom management behaviors had 3 instead of 4 domains, and they showed improvement on all 3 domains. So again, there's this relationship between, by improving teaching practice, where in the same people we're seeing this reduction in implicit race bias. And implicit race bias, just to sort of contextualize these findings, is very hard to move. Most interventions, if they have any effect, the effect is no longer present after like even a day. So there's something about developing these competencies through the types of practices that you're learning that really seem to have a pretty profound impact, both on internal world and experience, but also on our ability to enact, in this case, best teaching practices. So the sort of take-home point that I want to sum things up with is just that working toward one's own well-being, which is obviously a really important goal to have, working toward one's own well-being, working towards improving your professional practice, and being more equitable. In the context of schools, at least, these things are not, they're really convergent points. It seems like if we can affect and develop those competencies, then we start to see, both in well-being, personal well-being, and professional competency, these positive changes. So I think I'll just leave it at that, and I will take us off of shared screen.
Okay.
If I can.
Thank you, Matt. I'll be up there in a minute with Matt. This is Sarah. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes just saying thank you. And this is work that's Matt has shared in our district in a few venues over the last year, and some school-wide professional development, and some professional development with our student services team. And the work came together, I think, and we call it a fusion, as we're talking about bringing our work around mindfulness, awareness, and well-being with our equity work, and in particular our racial justice work. As the new strategic framework was built this all last year and culminated in the written plan that we have now last August. And I just want to acknowledge too that, and I'll speak more about that in a minute, but the audience that we have today and in this study in general certainly contains teachers and administrators and principals, and we're just excited to have this range in our schools, and also a wide range of roles at central office who support in so many ways, in so many really important ways, the work of teachers in schools. So I think the links are there for all of us, no matter what role we have in MMSD, to see how this is impacting teachers and then ultimately our student learning. So the framework really talks about this under the element of we invest in people, and honing in on culturally and linguistically responsive teaching being at the center. So that is all in the service of deeper learning for students. And we worked with Matt pretty closely on sort of a sidebar in that framework discussion, really making those links that Matt just made between the cultivation of mindful awareness, which is everything we've all been working on as a group of participants the last 4 weeks, going into our 4th week. And the connections, the benefit that has for our own well-being, that's been documented over the decades here at the Center for Healthy Minds and other places. And now just starting, I think, to uncover the connections that Matt has made for us and how we can directly start exploring together those connections between our own personal well-being, the impact on our relationships with others, and how that might impact student learning. And we have good evidence that that's a possibility. I just want to point out too that we've been partnering with a number of organizations in town, or I should say collaborating on this conversation. It's not unique in our district. We've been meeting with a number of school districts in Dane County to sit together on a every other month basis to explore this together. So the community of educators certainly in our region, but I think you'll see this happening across the country. We're starting to make these connections together, and that's, to me, very exciting and very powerful. One last thing, in particular, we supported the efforts of many to bring a person by the name of Rhonda McGee, Dr. Rhonda McGee, to our community in October. And Rhonda is a law professor at the School of Law at the University of California in San Francisco. She's a deep practitioner. She's a law professor. She has brought this work together in that sphere, and we were able to work with her at a public talk and then a day-long workshop with people across the community to really look at racial justice and the connections to mindful awareness. And we will, continue those kinds of connections with others who are doing the work. I think I'm going to stop there and just see if Matt has something else to say relative to that. We can continue talking here a little bit. I do want to point out that we also have resources, but I'll do that at a little later date, just so people here, know that after today and after this app, if you aren't aware, we do have district-based resources, so we'll make sure we get to that.
I don't think I have anything to
add to that
immediately, no.
Yeah, I had one question, and I've heard you talk about the pre-service, and I'm forgetting. That was a pretty large group of pre-service teachers. I'm just curious about the what that group looked like in terms of, I'm assuming they were all college age, probably,
yes,
and then ethnicity or other things you looked at, and whether you tracked any of that.
So this final sample was 98, so almost 100 people, and it was an undergraduate. I mean, in fact, probably some of you on this call know some of the people who were, because they're likely working in MMSD right now, at least some of them. So they were typical of the undergraduate pre-service teacher education program that we recruited from. So it was quite homogenous. The sample was like 95% white and maybe 92% or 92% white and 95% female. But that actually is quite representative of the teachers themselves, and nationally I think it's like 80 some odd percent of teachers are, it's either 80 something percent is female and 76% is white, or vice versa. But basically white women still predominate the teaching profession. So in that way, the sample was actually pretty representative of the national demographics. Yeah.
I think one thing I'd be interested in hearing from the group that might be out there, I think we have some of our participants out there. If you've been involved in some of our programming outside of the app, or now that you're involved in this app, just sort of what you're seeing in general, or some connections you're making with the topic that we're talking about today, which is the general science around the benefit of these practices for our own sort of inner work, but how this might be connecting to the outer work as well that we're doing as a district. So we can continue to kind of chat, but I'd say if there are questions or comments at this point, feel free to chime in.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah.
Hi. In talking with people who are using the app right now, it feels like the focus, people are able to prioritize their own well-being as a focus within their workday. And not that they didn't have that intention, but it's giving them, I mean, not to sound too mindful-ish, but an anchor to hang their hat on for moments of mindfulness. And, the beauty of it is that there's the district support for that as well. So really seeing people who could, I would say, would have verbalized before that it was a priority for their well-being, but now they have a tangible means of acting on that.
So that's a good thing, right? We're hearing that from participants. And Tamara, are you talking about they're able to actually use the app during the workday and find a
Yes.
way to
Yes.
carve out the 10 minutes or 20 or even longer that they might want to be tapping into that resource?
Yeah, and whether it's using the app or just having more awareness for themselves of making their well-being a priority. I think there's both, not just app dependent.
Right. I know that's true for me. I tend to use it at home. So I've changed my setting from remind me at 4 o'clock if I haven't done the app to remind me at 12 o'clock so that I actually get a reminder at work and maybe take a pause there to do my own practice or tap into the app. So it's been great to hear people talk about that and the support they're getting from people either supervising them or working alongside them, that's okay. So.
Yeah, there's a theory there's a scientific theory of behavior change, and Tamar, you presented sort of like 3 of the big components of that. So the first one is that you have to have some awareness of what you wanna achieve or how you wanna change. And then you need an intention to do it, which is where most people usually stop. Like they'll often get to, I know what it is that I hope to cultivate or change, and I have an intention to do it, but they don't have the sort of groundwork for then pushing that forward to actual behavior change. And that we think is where repetition and practice, and in this context, we're talking about developing sort of competencies of mind. So contemplative practices seem particularly well suited to that pursuit, but really practice of anything will then develop that behavior. So I'm glad to hear that people both are becoming aware of how important it is to have some intent to support your own well-being in the workday, but also finding time to actually do it.
Mm-hmm. And I think the app and the program actually outlines that pretty clearly. And so we've actually had some feedback that people would like to go back and be able to listen to some of those learning mini pods to have that kind of reinforced along the way. So we understand in the future that's going to be a possibility. Yeah. That notion of beginning again and, knowing that there always will be that point where we need to revisit our intentions and move forward. Yeah. I'm thinking about the work in the district that we're doing around restorative practices, and I'm not sure how many of you in central office might be as aware of that or in schools. But we have a team devoted not only to sort of shepherding the work around mindfulness, but also a team that has some overlap with that team, just really looking at restorative practices, and the frame of that is really anti-racist practice as well. So the notion of cultivating this moment-to-moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, and surroundings, that allows us to be present, for this work, this deep work relative to equity. And I think that's really the key point in our consultation with Rhonda McGee, that the sort of foundational work of awareness that can make us available and present for many things, including those interrelational, healthy interrelational activities. But in particular, linking it now to a commitment that's been made by our district to really look at anti-racist practice. So the other thing that the framework talks about is uncovering history, like being really knowledgeable about the history of racism and the effects of racism. And I think I see some connections between increased skill in being present and focused to be able to really take a look at things that might be difficult to take a look at. I know for me, just the last few years, and basically I would say the last year, delving much more deeply into what the history of other people in our country, of all peoples in our country, the history of slavery, the history of indigenous people. So I'm just starting to play with that idea of how much does my practice allow me to really uncover the history that seems essential to uncover to sort of move forward with healing and then learning.
Yeah, and I think that the study I presented on the teachers who went through an intervention where they learned to identify effective teaching practices and then videotape themselves over a course of a year and then coded themselves with a professional coder, that that study wasn't looking at awareness in the way we're talking about it, but my hunch is that's what happened. What that training taught those teachers to do first is become more aware of what good teaching practices are, and then to become more able to identify when watching themselves, whether they were enacting good practice or not. And then finally, because they did show change, ultimately that learning got integrated into their actual practice. Much like in mindfulness, as you do it a little bit more, you start to notice you're almost being mindful when you're not intending to. That's when it starts to become a habit, right? Mm-hmm. And so those teachers were able, through this process, to really internalize the awareness of and identification of effective teaching practices, and then actually enact it in the classroom. And the consequence of that was one of these sort of evidence points of bias in the classroom, which is this exclusionary gap in discipline along race lines, was eliminated. And just I want to contextualize that finding a little bit further, because exclusionary discipline actually predicts dropout rate, and subsequently it predicts incarceration. So African American kids in particular that have experienced being excluded from the classroom, either sent to the principal's office or on the far end, expulsion, those kids are much more likely to not finish high school and also to end up in prison. So these are like sort of early indicators of a trajectory.
The other thing I've heard you talk about, as something in what you just said triggered me to think about, you're looking at teacher motivation or motivation to teach, and it reminds me of those of us involved in this program talking about our inspiration, like what inspired us to move forward into this practice together. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about how you've looked at teacher motivation and the research you've been doing and the links to mindful awareness.
I mean, honestly, we haven't looked at it very well. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a difficult thing to do. We asked the pre-service teachers right when the study started, like on a 0 to 10 scale, how much do you think teaching was the right career choice for you? Mm-hmm. So this is a year into a pre-service teacher undergraduate degree, halfway through the program. And how much do you enjoy teaching? And not surprisingly, the averages were really high. We are tracking the pre-service teachers for 3 years post-graduation, so those data won't be collected until 2020, finally collected. But the point of doing that is to really look at obviously attrition is a big issue in teaching, so to look at what developing these skills and competencies might do to persistence in teaching. Mm-hmm. The idea being teachers who come in with more of these types of awareness skills are likely to just get less stressed, and therefore to be able to better manage the challenges of the teaching environment. But I think, and we don't have, other than asking people, we don't have really great ways of looking at motivation. But I think the reason, so the implicit race bias finding that I showed you, it was only on the version of the task that had child faces. So the way the task works is basically you're presented with faces of black and white children in this version, and then positive and negative attributes. And then in one block, your task is to, as quickly as possible, when you see a positive word, hit the key that corresponds to the white face. And then it switches. So, and a negative word to the black face, and then it switches. So then now in the next block, you're associating positive words with black faces and negative words with white faces. And that discrepancy in the time it takes for you to make these associations is what we call implicit race bias. We didn't see a change in the pre-service teachers on the version of that task that had adult black and white faces, only on children. And we don't know, but we sort of a priori hypothesized that this might be the case. And our thinking was that pre-service teachers, administrators, everybody that goes into education goes in because they want to support kids. They want kids to develop. They kind of have an inherent, I'll call it altruistic motivation on some level. And the training that we did with those pre-service teachers involved contemplations of really getting in touch with the caring motivation to teach and strengthening it, like really feeling like, what does it feel like that I'm entering into this because I want to see kids do well, and feeling that in the body. And then, through a mindful awareness practice, really strengthening that intention. And the idea of doing that was that when they got into a difficult situation with the kid, that maybe that intention would rise up to the fore and would sort of interrupt a lot of the reactive. So we don't know for sure, but it's my hunch that the reason why we saw a change on the child and not the adult version is because these were pre-service teachers training to work with PK through 8 kids. And their intention, their motivation was to support kids, and we did practices to build it. And so we saw that translate into kind of specific reductions. We saw reductions with adults too, they just weren't significantly different. But I think when I taught, I had a sort of mentor that had a very profound impact on me. And what he told me to do every day before I walked into school is basically just remember that on some level, I was teaching because I loved kids and I wanted them to develop well. And literally on my way into the building every day, I would do like a very short sort of contemplation on like, I'm walking into this building because, and it actually affected me. There were times during the day where I would recall, not on purpose, but that intention would just arise, and it would affect the way I subsequently interacted with kids, especially if I was getting reactive. So I think that type of sort of mindful awareness of our intention, our bigger purpose, helps pull us out of like the immediate things that can be often difficult, and gives us perspective on like, what's the bigger picture? What are we really doing here?
That's one thing I really appreciate about the guidance on the app is there's often a invitation to set an intention.
Oh, yeah.
Either going into the practice, and often at the end of the practice going into your day. So that's been kind of new reinforced learning for me is the intention setting. So that's a great example. I'm glad we talked about that. We'll take a little pause here. If people have questions bubbling, again, anything in general on their experience, anything specific to the work Matt's doing or sharing.
I've had a few questions come through on the chat that I can share. One is around resistance with some people, some colleagues having resistance to mindfulness practice as a way of well-being, and just curious if that's something that the two of you have run up against in your practice and your research, or if there's other tools that you would suggest as alternatives.
I mean, I think we've definitely both experienced that. People
within ourselves and others.
Yeah, that's true too, right?
Right. That's what I thought the question was going to be.
Talk to me tomorrow when I don't want to sit in the morning. I mean, I'm of the view that that it's probably counterproductive to push too much. And that I know, like, early in my meditation practice, I was like a proselytizer who was trying to tell everybody I knew that they should do this because it was so good. But I actually hadn't really cultivated much of anything at all. And they were probably looking at me like, here's this like guy who's saying meditate, but he doesn't really meditate. And he's not that happy, and he's kind of impatient and a little reactive. So why? So I think what happens, and there's even some schools in MMSD that I think are illustrative of this, but when there are people who are sincere and go about it and just do their thing, other people start to notice that something's happening. And then that tends to build a more, I think, kind of genuine curiosity about it versus really trying to push people who maybe aren't ready or willing or whatever.
Yeah. Our approach as a district has really been the opt-in approach. Our mindfulness in MMSD program, all of the courses, anything offered at a school that's longer than an hour is invitational, right? And that's not how all school districts are approaching this. And I think those that have kind of gone with a top-down, we're just going to get everybody in this program and see what happens. When you have even those few people on the sidelines in a lot of distress, you're sort of accentuating human suffering. It just doesn't really make any sense to me. So, we've definitely tried to honor, the fact that this work is evidence-based. Of course, for sure, that's why we're offering it. We know this can be helpful to people. We offer it with a lot of confidence, that if you engage in it, you will experience some benefit. But I think it's that balance of being enthused and honest about the benefits that you've experienced, but to not get too upset if other people don't want to come along. That's really not what it's about. So, but in an educational setting, it's good for us to be reflecting on that and talking about that.
And I know that this program is really focused on educator well-being, as it should be. I think that should always be the first step before we talk about giving stuff to kids. But that question becomes a really interesting question when you talk about doing mindfulness intervention instruction with kids in school, because they obviously they're not there by choice, and so I think. And I don't know that anybody has a great answer to how best to do it, but I think it's an important thing to consider.
We definitely have teachers offering these kinds of practices in their classrooms out of their own sort of embodied practice and linking it to social emotional learning work in their classrooms. We have schools approaching that even a little more generally as a school. But doing that, again, inner work first, and taking it a step at a time. And this might be a good place to talk about our resources just a bit. Matt will put up a visual of our website. And this has been around for over a year, but people don't always know it exists. So we have a website accessible through the Employee Wellness page or through the Student Services page. And if you scroll, I don't know if you can scroll down, Matt, but so there's this landing page, and there's descriptions of our courses. The resources page is really resources to, if you want to click on that, support personal practice. So you'll see and we just reviewed this again last August, so the links should all be working. Other ways that our employees, anybody working in MMSD, educators, and those supporting educators can access support for their own well-being. Our courses, district-wide, we have a 10-hour foundational course that's offered either over a 3-week period during the school year or over a week during the summer. We have days of mindfulness. We just had 35 of our MMSD community engage in a day of mindfulness on Saturday. Some of you out there were leading that. Thank you. And then more and more we're doing work around the fusion again of mindful awareness, restorative practices, social and racial justice. So really bringing that work together for groups of staff. And anything we offer district-wide, we're able to offer at the school or department level, sort of customizing that to the needs that people have as groups. So one thing I've really appreciated about this app, you can take this off now, is that even though it's an app and we have it on our phone and we do our own thing or not on a daily basis, HMI's really been clear from the inception that this is equally about building community around practice, and that's certainly where we're at as a district, that if we're going to grow and learn together, that's going to be the most powerful way to meet the needs of our students. So, so I see a nice synergy between what this program's trying to accomplish, aiming to accomplish and foster, and what we're doing in the district. So if you have more questions about resources, you can contact me at any point, but we do have a few minutes left here for more questions.
There's a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah, so one here is around, is there, have there been any conversations about offering this app in other languages, especially Spanish? And there are aspirations to translate and have this app have multiple versions. Right now, we're very much in the pilot phase of the program. So we're so grateful for all the feedback that we've been getting from MMSD and being able to see how you have it engaged with it. Another question that came through.
Monica,
oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I just want to add one more thing to this question. So there's another initiative that's been going on for about a year. It's a sort of collaboration between folks in MMSD at the center and a bunch of community organizations in Madison, like Centro Hispano of Dane County, for example, is one of them. And we're searching for funding right now. We have a couple grant applications out, but the intention of that project actually is to take sort of the mindfulness curricula that we currently have, which has primarily been developed by white people and primarily implemented in white spaces, and translating those curricula, or really even rewriting them if necessary, so that they're responsive to a diverse array of communities. So the group of people includes people who are, Mexican, Costa Rican, native Spanish speakers, Native American, there's white people, African American, there are white people involved, there are scientists, there are mindfulness teachers. It's a diverse group of people, but the intention is we're also acutely aware of this limitation, and the intention is to try to work towards providing some resources.
I'm glad you brought that up. It was on my list and I hadn't gotten to it.
Sorry to interrupt, Monica.
Oh no, great information to share with everyone. Another question was whether the Healthy Minds at Work program was designed for teachers. And I'm excited to hear that it was not initially designed specifically for teachers, but I will share that across the pilots, this group is really very engaged. We've noticed just people are using the app, or we can't see who's using the app obviously on the back end of things, but we just can see the progress of multiple users just really engaging every day and using it. And it's great to see that, especially with the groundwork that you all have been laying over many years, and there's so many tools, that this can be a part of the toolkit for educators. It's designed for people to use in workplaces, but we weren't sure what it would look like in an educational space. And it's great to see that it's been, seems to be pretty successful with MMSD. And Matt and Sarah, do you have anything more to add before we?
Just to echo the enthusiasm, the few people who haven't yet activated are like, I'm getting to it, I'm getting to it. So people who aren't on board sort of feeling like, well, maybe I'm missing something. And I just want to really point out our what you call internal champions, but people from our core mindfulness team who have taken on some extra responsibility to support people to use the app and program, and to come alongside people and support them. So I really appreciate every extra effort they've been giving to this as well. And I know it's part of your model, and I also appreciate that that's true, that we didn't have to think of that ourselves. So thanks for the support.
Great. We have a few more minutes left if there are any burning questions bubbling up folks want to share. All right. Well, oh, I'm seeing one question. Okay, great. So I think we're, yeah, sorry about that, a little technical. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Matt and Sarah, for the very engaging conversation. Really, really interesting, and it's great to see everyone on here on Zoom. Just a reminder that we do have our support@hminnovations.org email address. If any questions come up, if you're having trouble accessing the app, or even if you have feedback or suggestions for ways that we can make it better, please do email us at support@hminnovations.org. And we'll be sending out a short survey as well as the recording of this conversation later this afternoon. So please take 2 minutes just to share your feedback on the format and the content of the conversation. Thank you all so very much for your participation in the pilot. It's been a great learning experience for us to get to pilot this with MMSD, and we're so inspired by the work that you all are doing and the ways that these practices can really improve the lives of educators and thus the children that you all are teaching. So thank you all for all of your participation and practice. With that,
thanks everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Sandra. I can see you.